Welcome to NarrativeNook audio tales where enchanted stories come to life. If you enjoy our stories, please subscribe, like and share to support our channel. Enjoy listening. Roxanne returned to her senses and followed the children to the fountain. There were plenty of adults playing with their children. The entire area was filled with the children's laughter. When she saw the heartwarming scene in front of her, she couldn't help but smile. However, when she shifted her gaze to Lucian, she thought he didn't fit in with the scenery at all. The three children ran around while he stood emotionlessly at the side, allowing them to circle him as he stood still like a wooden pillar. Roxanne shook her head with amusement. Then she approached the children and played with them. With her joining the children, the space around Lucian instantly became emptier. The look in his eyes softened and his lips quirked up slightly as he watched the children play with her. Mommy. Miss Jarvis. The children suddenly stopped and turned in her direction, confused. At the sound of the children's voices, Lucian frowned slightly, only to see Roxanne standing next to a water pump. She was completely wet and smiling as she stood there. The children were initially shocked, but when they saw the smile on her face, they started giggling. Stupid mommy. Archie went over and pulled her aside. Only then did she return to her senses. The freezing water had caused her brain to short-circuit for a moment and her reaction to become slow. In retrospect, she too found it funny when she realized how silly she had looked earlier as she watched the children giggling. Just as they were laughing on their bellies, a coat was draped over Roxanne's body. Sensing the sudden warmth, Roxanne pulled the coat on her body and only turned back at the thought of something. She was stunned when she met his eyes. Thanks for the coat, Mr. Farwell, she said awkwardly. Seeing that she wanted to keep a distance from him, Lucian furrowed his eyebrows and said to the children, "You three play by yourselves for a while. Be careful not to get wet." The children nodded gladly and vigorously when they saw the two acting intimately. Upon getting the assurance from the children, Lucian pushed Roxanne by the shoulders out of the fountain without giving her a chance to speak. Roxanne tensed up when she noticed the two of them were getting too close to each other. Her attempt at escaping only made him hold her tighter. "I can walk by myself. Please let me go, Mr. Farwell," Roxanne said as calmly as she could as she scanned the surrounding. As soon as she finished, she could feel Lucian glancing at her. In the next second, his deep voice rang out next to her ear. "Do you want other people to see how stupid you are, Miss Jarvis? Even children wouldn't get drenched in water. You were drenched, but you didn't know how to step away." Roxanne's ears turned red. She wanted to explain that she had a brain freeze and couldn't react in time. However, thinking that the explanation would probably make her look even more stupid, she allowed Lucian to take her out of the crowd. "Thank you." Finally, Lucian stopped and removed his hands from her shoulders. She promptly left his embrace and stood at the side while hugging her arms. Lucian's eyes darkened when he saw that she was so eager to leave his side. Suddenly, the atmosphere between them became somewhat awkward. Roxanne didn't expect to spend time alone with Lucian, so she couldn't help but panic a little. The only thing she could do was stare at the children in the distance to distract herself. "Did you feel like you were forced to attend the concert today?" Lucian's voice abruptly rang out in the air. Roxanne was stunned for a moment. She turned to look at him and saw the unfathomable look in his eyes. He was frowning and his expression seemed a little awkward. It was as if he had deliberated over his words for a long time before saying them. Seeing that, Roxanne found herself feeling somewhat apologetic. "Do I look like it?" Roxanne thought about how they had been interacting with each other throughout the day and had to admit that she had been overly wary of him. Her expression softened, and with a smile, she said, "No. Seeing the children happy also makes me happy." Lucian pursed his lips, his eyes dark. "There's no need to force yourself, Miss Jarvis. You can tell me if you're tired." I've promised you I won't force you. Roxanne's heart clenched. I can't believe we still ended up talking about that even after I tried not to for the whole day. Indeed, he promised he wouldn't force me to do anything that night. He also said he hoped I wouldn't keep avoiding him and instead see him as a normal friend. Clearly, I failed at doing that today. In fact, I became even warier of him today. It's all because I haven't made up my mind yet. A troubled look slowly replaced the smile on her face. Lucian looked away and uttered in a deep voice, "Since I made a promise to you, I will keep my word and give you time to think about it." Then he stopped speaking entirely. Roxanne furrowed her eyebrows as Madeline's words from yesterday echoed in her mind. Madeline said the person who wanted to chase after her love was Lucian, Archie, and Benny's biological father, and the person she liked very much 6 years ago. It wasn't because she hated him that she kept avoiding him. It was because she was worried about her children. Roxanne still had no idea how she felt about Lucian. If he can explain Aubrey's matter to me, then perhaps. Noticing that her train of thought was going off the rails, Roxanne pinched her palm and forced herself to snap back to reality. I shouldn't think about nonsense like that. After a long silence and seeing that Roxanne did not have anything to say to him, Lucian pursed his lips self-deprecatingly. It's getting late. The children needs to go to school tomorrow. Let's head back early. Hearing his voice made Roxanne tense up again, but she let out a sigh of relief when she heard what he said and nodded non-committally. Both of them approached the fountain, one after another. Be careful. Roxanne's mind was still a mess, and she had walked toward a water pump absent-mindedly again. Suddenly, a big hand stretched out from her side and grabbed her arm firmly before pulling her away from the water pump. Upon returning to her senses, Roxanne raised her head and saw Lucian beside her. She felt a pang of unknown guilt in her heart as she said, "Thank you." Instead of replying, he furrowed his eyebrows and didn't let go of her wrist. She gently struggled to break free from his grip, but to no avail. Instead, they attracted a lot of people's attention. Under the colorful lights, both of them looked astounding in formal attire. Lucian's coat was draped over Roxanne's white dress, and he was holding onto her wrist domineeringly. They looked like a prince and a princess who were escaping from somewhere. Sir. Just as she was going to say something to make him let go of her hand, they heard a child's voice. They stood still and stared in the direction where the voice came from. A girl in plain clothing was hugging a huge bouquet of flowers in front of them and staring at them with an innocent expression. When the girl saw the two of them looking at her, she flashed a sweet smile. How about you buy a bouquet of flowers for her, sir? She raised the flowers in her arms. My flowers are very fresh and cheap. I swear. Lucian frowned, his instinct telling him that it was a scam. However, Roxanne was already kneeling in front of the girl. With a grin, she patted the child's head and asked softly, "Are you here selling flowers by yourself, little girl?" The child shook her head and held the bouquet with one hand before pointing at a stall not too far away from their location. Mommy's over there. I want Mommy to go home early." Roxanne's heart softened. Just as she stood up and wanted to pull out her wallet from her bag, she realized her bag was left in the car. At that moment, she had no money on her. The girl could tell she was interested in buying the flowers and was looking up at her with anticipation. Roxanne felt troubled. I know Lucian has money on him right now. If I ask him to, he'll definitely buy the flowers in the girl's arms. However, when she thought about that, her mind automatically reminded her of a past event that involved lots of roses. So she hesitated, fearing that Lucian would misunderstand her. She no need to look. Just as she was still wondering what to do, Lucian spoke. Roxanne turned back and saw that Lucian had already pulled out his wallet when she was still hesitating. Without even asking for the price of the flower, he took out a stack of cash from his wallet and gave it to the girl. As much as she wanted to help the girl,
Roxanne thought he was acting like a spendthrift. Just as she wanted to stop him, the girl's piping voice sounded. This is too much. I only need this much." With that, the girl carefully removed 2 bills from Lucian's hand and gave the flowers to Roxanne with a sunny smile. "You can have these, miss." Standing on her toes, the child placed the flowers in Roxanne's embrace. Roxanne grabbed the flowers and watched as the girl ran back to her mother's stall. The girl's mother smiled at them from afar after receiving the money from her. Roxanne returned a smile. After the girl's mother looked away, Roxanne suddenly realized something. Did I just receive a bouquet of flowers from him? Roxanne instinctively glanced at the man walking in front of her before lowering her gaze to look at the flowers in her arms. She hesitated about giving the flowers back to him. However, before she could say anything, the 3 children came up to her. When they saw the flowers, they were elated. Mommy, where did you get the flowers? They look pretty and they match you so well." Benny praised despite knowing who had given his mother the flowers. A wave of embarrassment washed over Roxanne at the boy's question. Right as she was about to lean over to hand the flowers to Estella, she recalled that the man was still holding her wrist. Evidently, that was something the children noticed as well. Upon her realization, Roxanne began to turn red in her face. Nevertheless, she forced herself to smile calmly at the children as she discreetly flung her wrist to break free of the man's grasp. Yet, the man only tightened his grip. Roxanne frowned and turned to protest. When Lucian met her eyes, he confessed, Miss Jarvis, you're holding flowers, and I'm afraid you'll end up soaked again if you can't see the road well. Don't worry. Once we're away from the fountain, I'll let you go." It was a subtle way of telling her that the flowers were meant for her. When Roxanne heard that and glanced at the hand around her wrist again, the blush on her face slowly spread to her ears. The children were around, so there was nothing much she could say. She could only quietly let the man do as he pleased, while she reassured herself that he was only holding her wrist. Lucky for her, the children did not ask where the flowers came from again. Are we going back now?" Archie, the sensible boy he was, asked. Roxanne inclined her head. Before she could say anything, the man said, It's getting late, and your mommy's drenched. If the temperature lowers later, she might catch a cold." A worried look manifested on the children's faces when they heard that. Let's hurry back then." Lucian nodded and gestured for the children to follow him as he turned and left. Roxanne was ill at ease, so she kept turning around to check on the children. Only when she saw that the children were right behind them did she let her heart lower back into her chest. Asso was still following Frida in the crowd with a bitter smile on his face. Even though he could see that her expression was darkening every passing second, he dared not voice a word of protest at all. They had not even had dinner as they stood outside the hall, waiting. It took a long while before Roxanne and the others came out. When they finally did, Asso thought that he and Frida could finally leave. However, those people began playing at the square. To him, they seemed happy. On the other hand, Frida's frown only deepened. She thought the most outrageous thing she would see was Roxanne and Estella wearing matching outfits. Yet, as it turned out, Lucian was treating Roxanne like she was his girlfriend. The two were far more intimate than Frida speculated. As a matter of fact, she was starting to suspect that Roxanne was going to win Lucian's heart if Aubrey did not act soon. When she thought about how she would have to be respectful toward the pretentious woman in the future because of Lucian, she fumed. Nevertheless, there was no reason for her to make a move, so all she could do was take photos of everything she saw and angrily send them to Aubrey. She refused to believe that Aubrey would be unfazed by the photos.
Roxanne had no idea that Frida had been spying on them the whole day. After entering the car, Roxanne and the children sat back in their original seats. As Roxanne sat in the front passenger seat and hugged the flowers Lucian had bought earlier, a strange feeling entered her heart. The flowers she received this time were far more ordinary than the roses Lucian used to send her every day. Yet Roxanne was much more touched by it than previously. Meanwhile, the children were clearly tired. Not long after they entered the car and chatted, they fell silent. Lucian glanced at them through the rearview mirror and saw that the children were all slumping, asleep in their child car seats. The woman beside him seemed to be a little in a daze as well. She was leaning against the chair, staring outside. He wondered what she was thinking about. At that, Lucian slowed down, for he wanted them to sleep better. Roxanne could sense him slowing down the car, and at that moment she felt that living her life like that was good too. The incident that happened 6 years ago was already in the past, and the 2 children she raised turned out fine. Furthermore, the children's curiosity about their father was getting stronger and stronger. In the past, Roxanne was terrified of Lucian snatching the children away from her if he were to find out about the children's birth circumstances. However, his actions were making her become more and more at ease. Madeline's advice rang in her head repeatedly. Despite Roxanne's reluctance to admit it, she had to eventually face her wavering stance. It was a silent journey. After a period of time, the car came to a slow stop outside Roxanne's house. Lucian then turned to the woman, thinking that she was asleep. She was not, to his surprise, but she seemed so lost in her thoughts she did not even realize they had reached her home. Lucian's eyes darkened and he could not stop himself from asking, "What are you thinking about?" Roxanne had been daydreaming since she entered the car, and Lucian was curious as to what matter she could possibly think so long about. The man's voice snapped Roxanne back to her senses, and she instinctively answered, "Nothing." Lucian could hear the hesitance in her voice, and the look in his eyes darkened even more as he gloomily stared at her. "You were thinking about it the entire way back here." Only at his reminder did Roxanne realize that the car had stopped. Lucian's gaze was intense, it felt like he was staring right into her soul. "Am I related to what you're thinking about?" he guessed as he continued to study her expression. Right as those words left his mouth, Roxanne's face paled and a flash of panic crossed her eyes. "It looks like I've hit the nail on the head." Realizing that, Lucian softened his grimace, delight thrumming through his veins. Although he did not know what she was thinking about, at the very least it was something about him. It meant that his efforts of the past few days had not been for naught. Lucian showed none of those thoughts on his face and went on, "Ms. Jarvis, have you realized whether or not I'm serious about courting you?" At that, Roxanne subconsciously turned to look at the children, fearing that they would overhear their conversation and come to another misunderstanding. "Don't worry. They're sound asleep," Lucian reassured when he sensed her panic. Undeniably, the children showed no signs of waking. Roxanne let out a sigh of relief before looking at the man. After mentally preparing herself, she said with faked calmness, "Before I answer your question, I think you should tell me about Ms. Pearson." Her words made Lucian frown as he grimly gazed at her to study her. If he did not mishear what she said, that meant that Roxanne was starting to waver in her stance. Roxanne blinked when her eyes met Lucian's. Then, she averted her gaze with false calmness. A moment later, Lucian's deep voice sounded out beside her ear. "I've never liked her romantically, and I'll never marry her. That's why there's nothing for me to explain to you." At that, shock flashed past Roxanne's eyes. If this were to happen 6 years ago, she would never expect to hear this from Lucian. He never liked Aubrey romantically? How can that be? She could still remember how Lucian had announced that he would only marry Aubrey and no one else 6 years ago. In fact, he did not even mind resorting to emotional abuse to make her leave. If he's saying this now, then what about what happened 6 years ago? Lucian's eyes were on her, so he saw all of the emotions that appeared on her face. When he noticed her shock, he frowned. Knowing what she was thinking about, he apologized in a low voice. "What happened 6 years ago was my fault. You can blame me for it, and I won't have a word of complaint." That only rendered Roxanne even more stunned and speechless.
She never thought she would hear Lucian apologizing for what happened 6 years ago. A beat later, Roxanne found her voice again. You don't need to do this. I told you that we can think of each other as strangers, and we won't owe each other anything. But I don't plan for us to be just strangers. Lucian interrupted, his forehead creasing. Roxanne, too, was frowning as she kept her gaze lowered in silence. Nevertheless, Lucian continued to speak as he stared at her face. I'm honest with you because, like you, I have a question to ask. I hope you'll be as frank as I was. Hearing him, Roxanne lifted her head to give him a bemused look. In the next second, the man's voice rang in her ear. What relationship do you have with Larry? Larry Morrison had always been a thorn in his side. Every time he saw Larry, he was reminded of the times Larry and Roxanne met in private. Furthermore, the few times he saw them together, they seemed close. Larry even knew about Lucian's relationship with Roxanne. How close are they for Roxanne to tell him about our relationship? Roxanne was stunned for a moment before her brows started to creep toward each other as a solemn look showed in her eyes. I've already told you many times that Larry and I are just friends. He lent me a helping hand many times during the most difficult time in my life. Mr. Farwell, please don't ask questions like these anymore. Your questions are only troubling Larry and me. Lucian had already asked Roxanne many times about her relationship with Larry, and by then, Roxanne was already getting frustrated by his fervent questions. She thought that Lucian would leave it at that after her explanation. Yet, without any hesitation, he went on, what about Jack? What relationship do you have with him? Roxanne was dumbstruck, for she did not know why Lucian was asking her that. I haven't known Jack for long. What makes him think that there's something between us? With that thought in mind, Roxanne gave him a puzzled look. At the same time, she noticed that he looked serious about it. He was genuinely worried about her being romantically involved with Jack. Mr. Damaris and Roxanne began to explain, but noises suddenly came from behind them. It sounded like the children had woken up. Thus, Roxanne cut herself off and turned around to look at them. Benny, who had woken up at one point, was rubbing his eyes groggily. After a while, the boy slowly lowered his hand and squinted at his mother. Mommy. Roxanne gave a quick glance at the man beside her as she tamped down the rising feelings in her heart. Once she recomposed herself, she flashed the boy a smile. Are we home? Benny sat up and sprawled at the window to look outside. When he saw the familiar mansion, he asked his mother in a confused tone, why didn't you wake us? Roxanne was reminded of her earlier conversation with Lucian, and guilt settled in her stomach. We just got here. I was about to wake you, but you woke up on your own. The boy was not entirely sober yet, so he did not dwell much on Roxanne's reply. He turned to carefully nudge his brother and woke him up. The noise woke Estella as well, who looked around in a daze, unable to figure out where she was for a moment. The awakening of the children signaled the temporary end of Roxanne and Lucian's conversation. Roxanne then turned back to Lucian and said, Thank you for sending us back, Mr. Farwell. It's getting late, so I won't invite you in for a drink anymore. With that, she opened the door and stepped out of the car before carrying the children out from the back seats. The night breeze was chilly. Although the heater was on in the car, Roxanne's clothes were still wet. Hence, she could not stop the shudder from going through her body when the wind blew at her. Both Archie and Benny shuddered from the cold as well. They quickly hugged their arms and stood at the side. When Estella saw the boys getting carried away by Roxanne, she stretched her arms out at the woman. I want to go with Ms. Jarvis too. The girl was still sleepy, and she sensed nothing of the strange tension in the car. All she did was express the thoughts that flashed past her mind. The moment Roxanne, who was about to close the car door, heard her, she froze in her tracks. A stumped look crept upon her face. Be good, Essie, and go back with Daddy. I have some work to do later, so I won't be able to take care of you. The collaboration with the Damaris family was already on the right track, and Roxanne had to put all of her focus on the project. Her schedule for that night was to read up a little more about ancient medicine. If she were to let Estella stay with her, it would undoubtedly disrupt her plans. It was a hard choice. Despite the ache in Roxanne's heart, she rejected the girl. After all, they had more chances to spend time with each other, but Roxanne only had one chance to work with the Damaris family. The girl's eyes were still watery from her grogginess, and she took some time to register Roxanne's rejection. A few seconds later, she pouted and stated, I can take care of myself. It had been forever since she got the chance to sleep with Roxanne. Roxanne felt even more helpless at the girl's pitiful look. Hence, she turned to seek help from Lucian. I have to prep for the collaboration with the Damaris family later, so I really don't have the time for her. Just as she said that, the man's expression darkened. Roxanne's heart lurched, recalling their conversation before the children woke. Clearly, the man was annoyed by her mention of the Damaris family. Roxanne never thought that Lucian would be so concerned about her relationship with Jack.
Estella pouted and was visibly upset. I can play with the boys. I don't need you taking care of me, Miss Jarvis. Roxanne felt a pounding headache when the little girl insisted on staying. She decided to try a different approach and said softly, "Why don't you come another day, Essie? I will surely accompany you by then. I really don't have the time today." When the little girl was about to say something, Lucian suddenly voiced, "Essie, Miss Jarvis told you she's busy. Don't disturb her further." As Roxanne had mentioned the Damaris family just now, his tone was rather clipped. Estella was shocked by her father's icy tone. She widened her eyes innocently and dared not say anything else as she gave Roxanne puppy dog eyes. The cold wind roused Archie and Benny from their grogginess. Likewise, they were taken aback by their father's tone. The two boys exchanged glances with each other. "We'd better not piss Daddy off in the future. He's so fierce." Roxanne disapproved of Lucian's stern manner and furrowed her brows in response. "Essie is still young. Don't vent your frustration on her and be more mindful of your tone." Lucian felt incredulous listening to her. She was the one seeking my help, and now when I help her out, she's commenting on my tone instead? Estella knew that Roxanne was backing her up and immediately nodded in agreement as she huffed at her father. Noticing the two uniting against him, Lucian massaged his temples and tried to suppress his anger. He toned down and said, "Quit messing around. Miss Jarvis is still dripping wet. She's going to catch a cold if she stays outside any longer. Essie, say goodbye to Miss Jarvis and close the door behind you." Lucian knew how to make his daughter listen after all. As expected, Estella hesitated when she heard Lucian saying that Roxanne might catch a cold. She relented and waved goodbye to Roxanne. "Hurry up and go on inside, Miss Jarvis. I will come to play with Archie, Benny, and you some other time." Roxanne let out a relieved sigh. She smiled and nodded at the little girl. "You're so thoughtful, Essie." Archie and Benny immediately huddled together near the car window when they heard that Essie was leaving and said, "We're going to take you skateboarding next week." Estella's eyes glinted and she nodded enthusiastically. She waved at them and was about to close the car door. Before she closed the door, however, Lucian's voice rang again. There was a hint of displeasure in his voice. "Essie, pass Miss Jarvis her stuff." Estella appeared lost and looked around the car. Then she noticed the bouquet of flowers on the passenger seat. The little girl pursed her lips when she noticed that Roxanne had left the flowers behind. She fetched the flowers and presented them to Roxanne. "You forgot your flowers, Miss Jarvis." Roxanne was stumped at the sight of the flowers. Lucian had not made it clear that the flowers were for her. In fact, she did not intend to receive any flowers from the man. Hence she left the flowers on the passenger seat when she got out of the car just now. Roxanne did not expect that the man would use such a way to let her know that the flowers were intended for her. Conflicting emotions welled up in her as the pang of realization hit her. Noticing that Roxanne had not taken the flowers, Estella nudged the bouquet forward and called out, "Miss Jarvis?" Roxanne had only snapped out of her own thoughts and took over the bouquet of flowers because of the girl's voice. She glanced at the man before her and muttered softly, "Thank you." The little girl beamed sweetly when Roxanne accepted the flowers. Nevertheless, Lucian remained impassive and urged Estella, "Close the door. We should head back now." Estella nodded and reached out to close the door. "Mr. Farwell, Essie is still a child. Please be more gentle when you talk to her." Roxanne could not stop herself from reminding Lucian again. After spending more time with the father and daughter duo, Roxanne realized that even though Lucian was meticulous in caring for the little girl, his tone was sometimes too harsh on her. Roxanne's boys would even get startled by his stern tone sometimes, not to mention Estella, who needed more attentive care. She had only reminded him out of goodwill. Yet she got a rather ambiguous reply from the man. "Essie doesn't need me to be more gentle. She needs a mother. If you're truly worried about her, why don't you reconsider what I've said?" Roxanne's face stiffened slightly. She cast a glance at Estella, who had overheard their conversation. The little girl cocked her head to one side and blinked in confusion, pretending as if she did not understand a single thing. Roxanne breathed a sigh of relief. Nonetheless, she still did not know how to reply to him. Essie closed the door. Lucian did not expect her to reply and asked the little girl to close the door. Roxanne took a step backward with Archie and Benny. After the door was closed, Lucian slowly drove away. Roxanne stood grounded even when the car was already out of sight as she kept replaying Lucian's words in her head. He said he wouldn't force me against my will, yet he said something like that right in front of Estella. Roxanne reckoned that he was still mad about her and Jack's relationship. Well, I did run right into the line of fire. That gave her a headache. Mommy, let's go in." Archie and Benny recalled Lucian's words and were afraid that their mother might catch a cold. Roxanne snapped out of her thoughts and nodded at her kids before bringing them into the mansion. The boys urged her to take a hot shower after they got back home. In the meantime, on the way back to the Farwell residence, Estella sat in her child car seat and pursed her lips into a thin hard line as she stared at the back of Lucian's head. Lucian could feel Estella's burning gaze on the back of his head. He furrowed his brows and asked, "What's wrong? Weren't you all right just now?" Noticing that her father was finally talking to her, Estella said in a huff, "Why were you so stern toward Miss Jarvis? She's going to run away if you keep doing that." Lucian frowned in response. He could not help but notice how much Estella resembled Roxanne in her mannerism. After all, Roxanne had also reminded him to be more gentle toward Estella. This mother and daughter duo really does have each other's backs, huh? No. I just want her to reconsider my offer. I've only said it like that so that she'll take it seriously, Lucian explained. He was feeling rather exasperated with himself. At the Pearson residence, a sulking Aubrey locked herself in her room. She was so pissed off about the photos Frida had sent her in the afternoon that she had no appetite for dinner. She did not expect to receive more photos from Frida when she was about to sleep. In the photos, the man, whom Aubrey could not get to meet no matter what she did, was doing all sorts of service for Roxanne, putting his jacket on her, buying her flowers, and holding her wrist. The two looked just like a couple in love. Rage burned in Aubrey as she looked at the photos. They were practically disregarding her position as Lucian's fiancée. If word got out, not only would she be utterly humiliated, but her dream to become Mrs. Farwell would also be shattered. A vicious look crept over Aubrey's face when she thought of that. That batch. Why did she even come back? She shot up from her bed and flung the things on the table to the ground. Downstairs, Gina was just worrying about her daughter. Earlier, when she noticed that Aubrey did not come downstairs for dinner, she had knocked on the latter's door but gotten no response. Now, upon hearing the noise coming from the second floor, she hurried upstairs to check on Aubrey. Aubrey, what's wrong? What's making you so upset? Gina tapped on the door frantically. This time, Aubrey opened the door immediately. Gina had no idea what was going on as she looked at Aubrey, who stood by the door with a grim expression. Oh, what's wrong? Tell me about it. Without saying anything, Aubrey returned inside and sat on her bed. Gina went in after her. Right when she walked up to the bed, she saw the unlocked phone beside Aubrey's hand. Its screen showed a few photos, which Gina assumed was the reason for Aubrey's outburst. At that realization, Gina glanced at Aubrey before carefully taking the latter's phone to check the photos. When she saw Lucian and Roxanne together in every single photo and how close they were, her face clouded over. What's going on? How did Lucian end up hanging out with this woman again? Irritated, Aubrey punched the bed without a word. Gina looked at her daughter's face again, only to find that it was now tear-streaked. Clearly, Aubrey was livid at the two pictured in the photos. Why didn't you tell me about such a major matter earlier? Gina was heartbroken and enraged at the same time. It was only then that Aubrey spoke. What's the point of telling you? I came up with so many ways before, but I still failed to stop them from getting together. At the thought of how her previous efforts were all in vain, Aubrey felt even more aggrieved. On the other hand, Gina was exasperated to see her daughter so upset. That woman is so shameless. She knows Lucian is engaged, yet she keeps on clinging to him. Even though they were married. Before, they have already divorced. She left him so resolutely back then. What is she trying to do now? Aubrey knitted her brows and said glumly, "What's the point of talking about this now? If this goes on, that batch will become his wife again. By then I will be a nobody and a laughingstock." Aubrey felt even more furious when that thought occurred to her, and she couldn't help but shed tears of frustration. Feeling distressed, Gina exclaimed, "No way. We cannot let her remarry him. Otherwise, all our efforts in the past years will be useless. We have to do something." Thank you for listening. If you have enjoyed this story, please like and share so others can see it too. Also hit the subscription button and notification bell so you can be notified on our next release. Thank you for your support. God bless you.